Hey, how you doing? Don't worry, I'm not gonna start rapping or anything like that. Just really cold in the office today. Let's begin with our World War One lecture. Sorry, I can't play the sound there today. Whenever I play embedded recording, YouTube will not let me post it then on YouTube. So imagine, if you will, or Google the song "War" from the 1960s. War, what is it good for? Of course, you know the answer to this question because you've heard the song. War, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Say it again. Well, that's not entirely true in the case of the United States. In World War One for the United States, what was it good for? As we'll see by the end of this series of lectures, national greatness. It is true that the 20th century was probably going to become the American century. It was probably going to see the emergence of the United States as a dominant power. But World War One really sped up that process. It made it almost inevitable that the 20th century was going to be an American century. So we need to talk about this war. Obvious question: how did the United States become involved in World War One? Instantly, the high school history gears are starting to kick in. You're thinking, oh, I remember something about Lusitania. If you had a really good coach, you might remember something about a Zimmerman note, Germany trying to tell Mexico to invade the United States. We don't generally like it when people try to tell Mexico to invade the United States. And all these different things going on. I want to suggest we're asking the wrong question. The question really we should be asking is, when did the United States and why did the United States decide to become a great world power? When those decisions were made, it was inevitable the United States would become involved in World War One. So let's see how that comes about. Understand that the United States in the years before the Civil War is generally described as isolationist. People go back and read George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and see them in speeches talking about no entangling alliances. This is a common phrase from this time. No entangling alliances. The United States should not have entangling alliances, especially with Europe. We should not form military and political pacts. Every few years somebody sneezes and Europe goes to war. We don't want to get dragged into those kinds of wars. We are more than happy to drag particularly France into our Revolutionary War, to help defeat the British. We don't want to get involved in their wars. So isolationism, political and military isolationism, run deep in our country. But the reality is, for our founding fathers, they did imagine, they had to imagine the United States as a commercial world power. After all, the North America was settled by Europeans who were instantly involved in an international trade or triangle trade between Africa and Europe. So we were always kind of an international in scope. As Jefferson would say before he said entangling alliances with none, he would say peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations. So there always was an international dimension there to the United States. It's just we did try to avoid both involving ourselves in European wars and having Europe involve itself in the United States. The so-called Monroe Doctrine from 1824 was the suggestion that Europe should stay out of not just North American affairs, but should stay out of American affairs in general. That we will run the Americas. Europe, you guys take care of Europe. Let's stay separate. But there always was this sense that the United States had a broader role to play. You guys remember Manifest Destiny from high school? You probably remember talking about this. And you're thinking, oh, Manifest Destiny, that's to fill up the continent, right? Well, yes and no. Let's look at the first mention of Manifest Destiny by a man named John O'Sullivan from 1845. This is a painting from 1872, which often suggests that kind of manifest destiny, God's will, the angels directing our course as we spread out west. Look at what O'Sullivan actually said in 1845. This is the first use of manifest destiny. It was the fulfillment. Notice past tense. It was the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. In other words, manifest destiny in terms of filling up the continent. By 1845, it's pretty much done. We've just annexed Texas. We're about to take over the southwestern part of what is now the United States from Mexico. We're just about ready to do that. So manifest destiny as a continental ideal is pretty much done. So then where do we look next? O'Sullivan says, no longer bounded by the limits of the Confederacy, it, meaning us, looks broad upon the whole earth, and into the mind of the Republic daily sinks deeper and deeper the conviction that civilization on the earth, the reform of the governments of the ancient world, the emancipation of the whole race, are dependent in a great degree on the United States. Manifest Destiny was an international ideal. It was suggesting that the United States had a special role to play, having now built up North America. We now had a responsibility to begin, but had a responsibility to fill up the world, to spread American ideals and American values and American know-how to the rest of the world. As he said, the reform of the governments of the ancient world, meaning it's time for us to think about how we're going to influence or reform Europe. He's particularly thinking in terms of turning Europe into a more democratic regime of states. But the emancipation of the entire race. I mean, this is a global program that's being laid out here in 1845 by O'Sullivan. Of course, we had this little hiccup. As the Americans had expanded west, should slavery go with them or not? That had been the central question of the Civil War. So the Civil War, understand, was not fought over the morality of slavery. Nobody really questioned that slavery, very few Americans questioned that slavery was immoral, or thought that slavery was immoral. They were happy with slavery in its existing bounds. They just didn't want it to expand to the West. And that's what really brought on the Civil War. Hard for the Americans to think about reforming the governments of the ancient world when we ourselves are in the midst of a bloody civil war. So it takes us some time, even after the Civil War, to begin to recover that sense of we have a global role or a global mission or a global responsibility to play. But it's in the 1890s that we begin to recover that. With the advance of industrialization, urbanization, with the integration forces that are taking place in the United States at this time, Americans are, and you already know this from reading Teddy Roosevelt's Strenuous Life speech, Americans are thinking about the expanding beyond the boundaries of North America. And it's all the countries that Roosevelt was talking about. We're looking at places like Hawaii and Guam. Ultimately, this program of international expansion, of territorial expansion by the United States will begin in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. And you already know a little bit about the Spanish-American War from reading Gerstle and the Rough Riders and all those things. President McKinley's splendid little war, as he called it, where understand the Cubans had been wearing down the Spanish there for well over 30 years. Through insurgency, the United States stepped into that conflict, and within 6 weeks, we had defeated the Spanish. Again, the Spanish were not really at their imperial best by 1898. They didn't have the resources to commit to it. The Cubans themselves had already been weighing the Spanish down for decades. But the Americans stepped in here and in 6 weeks declared that we had defeated the great imperial power of Spain. And I don't know if this will surprise you or not, but we exaggerated exactly the scale of our victory here in 1898, but it served domestic purposes too. This was one of the first events that Americans, north, south, east, west, could celebrate this war and celebrate our victory over the Spanish. So it was a unifying, nationally unifying event. And it convinced many Americans that it was time for us to enter into a Manifest Destiny 2.0. That it was time for us to think about how we needed to be expanding too. That's not necessarily going to take place in Cuba, but it is going to be a consideration when we work out a peace program with Spain. We get more than just Cuba in that particular deal. We also get the Philippines, and that's really where the question really arises. What should the United States do with the Philippines? We've already been through the 1890s talking about what role are we going to play in Hawaii, if any, what role are we going to play in Guam, in Samoan Islands, Cuba. We're still debating that issue. But the question that really ends up becoming a national debate is the question of the Philippines. And you'll see in this debate, this is really the first great foreign policy debate that Americans have had, probably in 100 years. We had, during the 1790s, we had significant debate over should we join with the British in the Napoleonic Wars, should we, or the French Revolution, more earlier than that, or should we side with the French? Should we help the French in the way that the French had helped us? And that had really significantly divided Americans in the 1790s, contributed to a lot of the political chaos of that decade. In the 1890s, it's the issue of the Philippines. Americans are debating this issue at all levels of American society and coming to some very different conclusions. There's a number of Americans say we should just leave them alone. They dust off George Washington and Jefferson, no entangling alliances. You see that phrase all over the press. No entangling alliances. We should just leave the Filipinos alone. There's all kinds of racial arguments being made. We can't even control the populations of color within the United States. Why do we think we can take 6 million Filipinos and bring those, make them Americans or make them American citizens? It's not going to happen. So there's a racial argument for saying, we need to focus on getting our own minority populations under control. That whole Plessy versus Ferguson thing, right? Jim Crow, segregation, that's all going on at this time. And a lot of these people are saying we can't be taking on other populations at this time too. And then this is a variety of arguments against. There were two main arguments for taking the Philippines, and you can't understand why the United States becomes involved in World War I or the shape of American foreign policy throughout the 20th century, maybe even into the 21st century. It's a little bit more debatable. You really can't understand American foreign policy, what drives American foreign policy, without understanding this debate over the Philippines. All right, so there's two arguments for taking the Philippines, and one is an economic argument. It's an economic argument going back to the hardships that Americans have been facing since the Civil War. Remember, I've talked about this. 1876-77, Major Depression. 1883 to 1886, Major Depression. 1893 to 1896, another Major Depression, the worst in American history. Thousands of businesses closed, banks closed, tens of thousands of businesses closed, 20% unemployment within the United States. People are asking the question, why is this happening? What is, what is the problem? What is causing this erratic business cycle? It was farmers who actually were the first ones to hit upon this, but by the 1890s, it's elites recognizing this too. And the problem with American economy is the problem with the world's economy, and it was summed up by many during this time with just one word: overproduction. The problem with America and the problem with the world is we've gotten too good. It's an ironic problem. We've gotten simply too good at producing. This is first felt in foodstuffs and agricultural products, but by the 1890s, it's starting to be an issue for manufactured goods as well, too. We are simply too good at producing food in an international market when American farmers are no longer competing just with other American farmers, but they're competing with farmers in Western Europe, There's a boom in agriculture in Central Europe during these years. Suddenly, the world market is flooded with agricultural produce. Now, what do you know when there's an abundance of product on a market? What does that do to the price of that? It goes down, right? Price of a product goes down. What ripple effects does that have? Right? Lower prices for goods means less profits. Less profits means what? You have to scale back your production, which means you have to scale back your business. Your business has to contract. What does business contraction look like? Well, at some point, business contraction looks like unemployment, even mass unemployment. So you see what starts as, what should be a good thing, overproduction. We can feed the world, many times over with what the world is producing, what the international markets are producing after the Civil War. But this very situation creates a ripple effect, which leads to, in countries like the United States that are tied into these international markets, creates this glut of products and lack of investment, and ultimately overproduction, ultimately unemployment, mass depression. So it's an ironic situation the world and Americans find themselves in. What should be a good ultimately is leading to devastation, to chaos, to significant conflict within the United States. So how do you solve a problem like overproduction? Normally we would have this discussion in class, and usually the first hand going up is somebody saying, cut back production, just produce less. But of course, that's just giving into the problem, isn't it? If you just start scaling back your production, inevitably you're going to have to contract your business and you're going to have to lay people off. So that's not a solution. And here's another one of those ironies, right? The problem is overproduction, but the solution can't be stopping or cutting back production. You have to be able to continue to produce to the full. But you have to figure out how to sell that stuff too. So what are some of the, what are other answers we could come to? Some argued at the time, and mainly these were socialists in the United States arguing this, saying, look, the problem isn't overproduction, the problem is underconsumption. The problem isn't that we have Americans at this time who all have abundant food. They don't. We have millions of Americans who can't afford all this food that we're producing. You have billions of people around who can't afford the food that the world is now producing. So the problem really isn't overproduction. The problem is, how do we get this food into people's hands? And that's a question of how do we get money into those people's hands? And so these were questions of socialist reforms that needed to take place. How do we redistribute wealth? How do we get wealth into the hands of the poorest peoples so that they can afford this food, right? And then you solve the problem of depression, right? When you have a larger pool of people like buying stuff, then you don't have this overproduction problem. So this is where questions like paying a living wage, even a minimum wage, unemployment insurance, the socialistic reforms of the 20th century are being suggested here in the 19th century as a way to solve what isn't, socialists felt, a problem of overproduction, but rather a problem of underconsumption. Americans are not quite at this time ready to buy the underconsumption argument. Now, the New Deal, when we get to it, will engage in underconsumption strategies, but not at this time. So how do you solve a problem like overproduction? The markets that exist, or the markets you have right now, can absorb all the products that you have. So what's the solution? Open up new markets. Find new markets. Find new markets for your agricultural goods. Find more markets for your manufactured goods. John Rockefeller liked to tell people, I would love to buy everyone in China a kerosene burning lamp. And why? Because John Rockefeller is just a great philanthropist. He really wants everyone to have a nice lamp. And it's like, no, he wants to sell them Standard Oil. He wants to sell them as kerosene. Uh, that would, China would be a great market for the United States to begin selling not just foodstuffs, but manufactured products like Standard Oil. And so the question becomes opening up new markets, which inevitably becomes a question of what role should government play in opening up new markets. Enter Charles Conant's essay. Here we are. Just making sure doing well on time here. Charles Conant's essay, The Economic Basis of Imperialism. Now, people were already coming to this conclusion before Conant wrote his article here in 1890. There you go, 1898. In the North American Review, they're already coming to this. What Conant does is kind of take these arguments that are around and really kind of systematize them and help build a consensus after 1898 on how we solve this problem of overproduction. Now, if you read through this essay, you're going to see him talking about the problem of excess of savings. You'll see him actually use the word overproduction at some point. What Conant ultimately is suggesting here is what other people are coming to the same conclusion. We need to open up foreign markets. We need to figure out how to expand American selling of goods beyond just North American shores to other countries. That's inevitably a question for government, right? It's not like, if Americans wanted to sell new products in China, the businessmen just go and start doing that, right? Ultimately, this is a question that government has to work with the Chinese government to establish rules of trade. Right? Government has to do the businesses of opening up new markets and negotiating how markets will open, how much they will be open. Right? This is the issue of government, and of course the other issue is what happens if markets that we really want to be in don't want to open. That's a question for government too, and ultimately, as Conant suggests, it's an imperial question. All right. So the United States understands, to solve a problem of overproduction, and the way that other countries are figuring this out too, they have to open up new markets. Government has to be involved in this issue of opening up these new markets. What does this have to do with the Philippines? What does this have to do with the Philippines? Is the question, how do we sell American Standard Oil and wheat and corn? Is it how we sell that to the Philippines? Are we looking to open up the vast Filipino market? Is that why the Philippines are important to American policymakers at this time? Is this why Teddy Roosevelt in his strenuous life makes such a big deal about taking over the Philippines? No, there's not a great Philippine market for American goods, right? So why are we so interested in taking the Philippines? Well, ask yourself, what are the Philippines kind of close to? Yeah, and I know some of you are hinting on this. They're close to China. Now, are the Americans interested in the China market? Yeah. We've been interested in the China market for a really long time. We've been talking about the China market for well over 100 years. How can Americans, yes, and think about that in light of trade dynamics today. Imagine a time in which Americans were asking themselves, how do we as Americans sell more goods to China? That had been the dream of the 19th century. Finally, here in 1898, it seemed like it was an imperative that we had to open up the China market for American goods. And to the Philippines, they are not of immediate support. in terms of a market for American goods, but they are strategic support. Captain Alfred Mahan, one of the great naval theorists and theorists of this economic imperialism at this time, Mahan looked at the Philippines, as he called them, stepping stones. The Philippines would be great places to put American bases, so we could protect American ships, refuel American ships, and the Philippines would be the gateway for the United States to begin opening up the China market. So understand the goal. The solution to America's erratic business cycle was opening up new markets. The new market we really wanted to open up was China. Yes, again, try to understand a time in which Americans thought we would be selling an abundance of products to China. Of course, it's a little bit of a role reversal in your lifetime today, isn't it? But we need the Philippines for the strategic and for this economic mission to solve America's overproduction by opening up new markets, particularly by opening up the China market. But here's the thing. When you read Roosevelt's speech, was there anything in it about stepping stones or about opening up new market? No, it's not there. So there's an economic argument being, well, it's not there, but it is there because it's everywhere. It's ultimately the driving force and the rationale for why we are thinking about taking countries like the Philippines, why we're thinking about the China market. It's everything to do with economics. But here's the other point. While there's an economic argument being made for taking the Philippines, understand the economic argument is almost always hidden or embedded in a cultural argument for taking the Philippines. So there's two arguments being made by Americans at this time. The predominant argument that you would see from Americans like Teddy Roosevelt is the cultural argument. We need to take the Philippines not for our own interests, not for our own good. We need to take the Philippines because this is in their best interest. It's in the world's best interest. This is really the Manifest Destiny 2.0. That is America's destiny, America's responsibility to, now that we have tamed, now that we have civilized the savage North America, now we begin to do that in other parts of the world. This is the so-called white man's burden argument that you see featured there. And it looks very much like a Teddy Roosevelt character, isn't it? It's from the Detroit Free Press of 1899. And it looks like Teddy Roosevelt has picked up that Filipino, and a Filipino who honestly looked like stereotypes of Jim Crow stereotypes from the American press. Teddy Roosevelt is picking up our savage and carrying him up to civilization. Let me show you some examples of how this economic argument is embedded in cultural arguments for Americanization, for Christianization, but that's a little bit more complicated, right? The Filipinos already had been Christianized by the Spanish, but the Spanish were Catholics. And so a lot of Americans felt like, well, we need to give them the proper Christianity, which is Protestant Christianity. Even in Conant's essay, right, the economic basis of imperialism, he's clearly making an economic argument here of how we solve overproduction. But look at how he's talking about this, this instinctive tendency of a race or civilization often outruns the wisdom of its leaders, and talks about conquest and expansion and all these things, the irresistible tendency to expansion which leads the growing tree to burst every barrier which drove the Goths and the Vandals and finally our Saxon ancestors in successive and irresistible waves. Right? This is not an economic argument. This is a cultural argument, that there's just something about certain peoples that they have an instinctive tendency to expansion, that expansion is this kind of natural or normal for certain people. And here's where you really see a cultural argument emerge. Just, before he even gets into the economics of things, here's Conant talking in these very cultural terms. This new movement is not a matter of sentiment. It is the result of a natural law of economic and race development. The great civilized peoples have today at the command the means of developing the decadent nations of the world. And there you have it. There you have very much the Teddy Roosevelt strenuous life kind of speech. The civilized peoples have a responsibility to the decadent peoples. He's even beginning to introduce this language of the 20th century. You've probably heard language of like development, underdeveloped, developing, these terms that marked how the Western world in the United States thinks about the rest of the world in terms of developed, developing, underdeveloped. There's a language that's beginning here in this kind of emerging out of this kind of imperial mission here. And Conant's suggesting, look, Americans have a responsibility as one of the great civilized peoples of the world. We have a responsibility to go to places like the Philippines and develop these decadent peoples, to give them the blessings of American democratic government and American science and industry and American religion and American education, right? We're doing this not because of economic arguments, but of course we are, right? That's the driving force, but that's not how it's being sold at this time. It's being sold as we need to do this because this is just what civilized peoples do. They go out and they develop the decadent nations of the world. Or take a look at, you had Roosevelt's speech, another famous speech from this time from the Indiana Senator Albert Beveridge, 1898, an argument for taking the Philippines. Fellow citizens, in a noble land, God has given us a land that can feed and clothe the world, a land whose coastlines would enclose half the countries of Europe, a land set like a sentinel between the two imperial oceans of the globe, a greater England with a nobler destiny. It is a mighty people he has planted on this soil, a people sprung from the most masterful blood of history, a people perpetually revitalized by the virile, man-producing working folk of all the earth. A people imperial by the virtue of their power, by right of their institutions, by authority of their heaven-directed purposes. The propagandists and not the misers of liberty. It is a glorious history God has bestowed upon his chosen people. Interesting. Americans are the I thought that was the Jewish the Jewish people, but no, apparently that's the Americans. Understand, God has given this great destiny to the United States. And the question that Beveridge has for his audience is, what are we going to do about it? The question is larger than a party question. It is an American question. It is a world question. Shall the American people continue their resistless march toward the commercial supremacy of the world? Shall free institutions broaden their blessed reign as the children of liberty wax in strength until the empire of our principles is established over the hearts of all mankind? Have we no mission to perform, no duty to discharge to our fellow man? Has God endowed us with gifts beyond our deserts and marked us as the people of his peculiar favor, merely to rot in our own selfishness, as men and nations must, who take cowardice for their companion and self for their deity, as China has, as India has, as Egypt has? You see, especially in that last paragraph there, a significant Teddy Roosevelt strenuous life ideal there, right? Look at the great empires of history in the past: China, India, Egypt. Why did they decline? It's what hurt them, and Beveridge and Roosevelt and others are saying they stopped expanding. They gave up on their mission. They had a mission, and they gave it up. They became, as he suggests there, rot in their own selfishness. He's suggesting that's what these people did. They abandoned their mission, and they lost. And so Americans, we can't do that. What Beveridge is expressing here is the Spider-Man principle. You guys know Spider-Man, right? You know what? Spider-Man's kind of mission statement. What's the Spider-Man concept? Right? With great power comes great responsibility. The Beveridge, that's what he's trying to tell Americans at this time. Be Spider-Man. You've been given great power. You have a great responsibility to use that to civilize other peoples. Did you see, as I read through this, did you see the economic argument? It's there. Unlike in Teddy's speech, it's really hidden there. It's here, in just like it is in Conant's speech, it's here in Beveridge's speech, but it's embedded. It's very quickly passed over. Notice this question: shall the American people continue to march toward the commercial supremacy of the world? That's what taking the Philippines was all about. It was ultimately about how do we open up the China market and using the Philippines as a stepping stone for American interests in China. But notice how quickly Beveridge acknowledges that this goal of commercial supremacy in the 20th century, but how quickly he passes that over for this kind of cultural mission of Americanization. That is responsibility of the Americans to go out and to civilize these savage Filipinos. Just one final piece of text: the white man's burden. This is that image of the white man's burden that you saw there in the Detroit Free Press comes from a speech from a British poet this time who talks about the white man's burden. You guys are welcome to kind of read that on your own. Yeah, I struggle with this poem. Is Kipling actually, trying to tell Americans, look, just like British did in the 18th and 19th centuries, we took up the white man's burden to go civilize Africa, to go civilize India. It's your guys' turn now. It's the Americans' turn to go out and to civilize the savage world. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go send your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. Is he being sarcastic? Is he calling Americans to this mission, or is he suggesting that as you do this, you're really going to lose yourself? I don't know. Maybe this is something we should talk about in class on Wednesday and Friday. You guys can read through this, stop if you want, and just kind of read through the poem. Maybe you can help me out. I don't know whether Kipling is being sarcastic or whether he's actually saying, look, Americans, go out and do this, and kind of cheering Americans on to take up this mission. I'm not sure. Maybe you guys can help me out with that. But what's clear is, again, the economic argument for taking the Philippines is very much embedded in a cultural argument. We need to take the Philippines not because we're interested in using them as stepping stones to get into the China market. We need to take the Philippines because the Philippines need the blessing of American/Western/Christian civilization. And we have to go out and do our Manifest Destiny 2.0 of emancipating the entire race from bad religion, bad education, bad science, bad culture, bad language. Right? Everyone should speak English. We need to go out and do this cultural mission. This is the predominant argument that's made, the cultural argument. The Christian missionaries were some of the largest purveyors of this imperializing of the Philippines at this time. My first paper in graduate school was kind of looking at this Christian imperialism over the Philippine question. It's amazing how widespread this debate was. And even with all the opposition to it, ultimately, the Americans do take the Philippines. The economic argument for taking the Philippines to open up the China market wins, but it wins only because the cultural argument is made to the American people. Look, we have this responsibility to the rest of the world. And it starts with the Philippines. Just so you know, the Filipinos were not too happy. They were glad to be liberated from the Spanish. They weren't too happy to be under this Americanization project of the Americans. So we did actually fight an imperial war against Filipinos for about 4 or 5 years. And about 20,000 Filipinos lost their lives in this war, with the United States trying to convince them that it was in their best interest to live under our Christian tutelage. If the word empire in terms of a formal military political occupation of a foreign country brought about through some kind of conquest, if that kind of understanding of imperialism fits the United States, it was really at this time, it was really during these years that we are fighting a war against the Filipinos in order to ultimately to make that a kind of a formal American territory. One of the questions throughout this course, one of the questions obviously through this series of lectures and possibly for your first midterm is to what extent the United States can be considered to be an empire. To what extent American, the word imperialism fits America and fits American history. Now you saw with Beveridge, and I'll just go back to it quick. You saw him there. There's this phrase, shall free institutions broaden their blessed reign over the children of liberty, wax and strength, until the empire of our principles is established over the hearts of all mankind. Empire, what is an empire of our principles? This in some ways gets at the more unique form of American imperialism. If we want to use that term in the 20th century, some people called this a market imperialism or soft imperialism. But Beveridge is suggesting here that an American empire is not going to be a kind of British empire in India. It's going to be different. Our ideals are going to become imperialistic. Our ways of our culture is going to become imperialistic in some kind of way. It's going to be a peaceful conquest, if that's possible to imagine. Well, ultimately, the country listens to your Teddy Roosevelts, your Albert Beveridges, your Charles Conants, and we do take the Philippines. It takes a little bit of war, but it does happen. So then, how do we get into China? Well, here's one of the problems America faces as they take the Philippines, as they begin to open up the China market. Here's the problem. There is no China in 1899. China does not exist. China has been carved up between the great world powers, and you can kind of see them there and how they have carved up China by 1899. There is no China. Look, the rest of the world is trying to solve its problem of overproduction, and the way that they're doing it after 1850 was through advancing their imperial projects. So Britain, they tightened their hold over India after 1850. They began to make their way into Africa, as all the European powers did after 1850, began kind of formal political and military conquest and control over places like Africa during these years. But they're also doing it in China as well too. And this is how they are trying to solve their overproduction problems. How do we secure guaranteed markets for our goods? Through the formal political and military control of other peoples in the world. And that begins in places like India, in Africa, and now in China. So it's an imperial answer, right? I mean, Conant has suggested the economic basis of imperialism, right? Well, Europe had already kind of been advanced at this before the United States, and so they have already formally taken over political and military control of places that America wants to get in. We're not too interested in India or Africa, but we're very interested in China. The problem is China doesn't exist. So how do Americans open up the China? We got the Philippines now. How do we open up the China market under these kinds of conditions? Well, England had done this before. We had even done it too in the 1850s. Gunboat diplomacy. We just defeated the Spanish in Cuba, so let's sail our amazing navy down into China and strong arm our way into the China territory. Well, look, it was one thing for the United States to defeat the Spain in Cuba, but our navy is not first rate. It's not even third or fifth rate. We have barely any military whatsoever. The kind of military supremacy of the United States that we take for granted today is not there at this time. There is no strong arming our way into China. So if you can't force your way, if you can't force somebody to do what you want, what do? What's the alternative? And this is what I call the pretty please argument. These become known as the open door notes. These are a series of letters written to the imperial powers by Secretary of State John Hay, who was Secretary of State under President William McKinley at this time. McKinley in 1898 had said in regards to China, asking only the open door for ourselves, we are willing to accord the open door for others. This is ultimately an argument for increasing free trade around the world. McKinley said, look, if you guys give us an open door or free trade in China, we'll give you free trade in the United States. The United States was a great foreign market too, but the United States had, throughout the 19th century, kept a high tariff up protecting American goods. Right? You know what tariffs do? The tariffs increase the price of foreign goods through a tax, which the intention is for people then to buy domestically, to buy American instead of buying these foreign goods. We had traditionally been a protectionist state. McKinley is saying, we're finally willing to lower our barriers if you guys are willing to do so in China. John Hay called this, the idea was for a perfect equality of treatment regarding China. Hay's argument in his letters that he writes to all the great powers, look, if you guys want to, maintain your military in China and set up a political bureaucracy, you guys go ahead and do that. But when American businesses and American investors come knocking on your sphere of influence, treat them the same as you would your own businessmen. Give them a perfect equality of treatment. If you do this here, if you do us this solid in China, we're going to do the same for you in the United States. We're going to lower our tariffs. We're going to stop discriminating against your products. We're going to allow you to come into the United States and compete with our goods if you are willing to do the same in China. This is the first time the United States is making an argument for global free trade. Britain had at points in the 19th century argued for global free trade, for a lowering of protective tariffs. We are doing so now here in 1899 in regards to the China market through these series of letters, the open door notes. Give us access to China, give us access to your sphere of influence so we can invest, so we can trade, so we can solve our problems of overproduction, and we're going to give you access to the American market so you can solve your problems of overproduction too. And wouldn't it be better for the world if, this, you have to imagine, right, this kind of spheres of influence thing that's going on there in China, that the Chinese aren't too happy about it, but you got to think that there's a lot of tension there between the Russians, Japanese, British, French, Germans, all engaged in conquest there in China, that this is just a very volatile situation that could explode in tensions in other places of the world or back home in Europe. Right? The world is a tense place in the 1890s, and Hay and the Americans are coming along and saying, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we could kind of loosen these tensions? And one of the ways to do that is through allowing for free trade. Of course, the question for us is to consider is, ultimately, American interests, right? America first. Ultimately, America's interests are solving its own overproduction problems. How does a problem like global free trade solve our problems? If we're going to allow foreign companies access to our markets, isn't that going to hurt our economy? If we're going to allow other countries to compete, if we're going to allow other countries to compete in China with American products, is that ultimately going to benefit the United States? How does a policy of global free trade benefit the United States economically? And another way to consider that question is to look at just the United States itself. Is it true that every state within the United States is created equal? We have free trade within the United States, right? I mean, actually, there are some taxes that it's more entertainment taxes. Athletes could tell you about this. For a professional athlete to go play baseball in a different state, they end up paying all these entertainment taxes and stuff. So there is some discrimination that goes on between states. But for the most part, I don't have to go through some kind of checkpoint when I cross from Michigan to Indiana, or Indiana doesn't necessarily make me pay a special tax on my goods. I mean, we have a free trade within the 50 states. Um, as a result of that free trade within the 50 states is that all states equally benefit from prosperity. Are New York and California and Arkansas and West Virginia, are they all on equal footing in terms of their economic potential? And you know the answer to that. No. If California was a country, it would be the sixth largest economy in the world. Um, same with New York. What Arkansas, West Virginia, they're not anywhere near the the economic power of a New York, and it's because free trade doesn't lead to doesn't lead to equal ultimately equal economic benefit. It leads to monopoly. Certain parts of the United States profit, and others are left behind. Uh, that is what will play out globally as well too. Will a policy of global free trade, is it going to benefit all countries equally? Or is it going to benefit the country that is best situated to profit from those low barriers? By this time, the United States is competing with England and Germany for the top economy in the world, but everybody knows that the 20th century, in terms of economic output, is going to belong to the United States. We produce more goods, we produce more quality goods than anyone else. It's going to be an American century, and people recognize that at this time that we're writing books like America's Economic Supremacy. Even other countries, a British journalist, 1902, wrote a book, The Americanization of the World, the Trend of the 20th Century. Even foreign observers of the United States are recognizing the United States is going to dominate the world economically. The title of the book suggests with Americanization, as Americans dominate the world economically, they're going to dominate the world culturally, as American products, as American businesses, as American money flow to the rest of the world. American culture is going to flow to the rest of the world too. The world in the 20th century, this is British citizen, the British journalist is saying, the world of the 20th century is going to be an American century. It's going to be one in which the Americans Americanize the rest of the world. A policy of global free trade is not going to benefit everyone equally. It's going to benefit the strongest. Remember your survival of the fittest? Nobody's more fit in the world, economically speaking, than the United States in 1899. And whenever that's the case, whenever a country is really fit, to use that Darwinian term, is really fit, they are usually the country that's arguing for expanding free trade because they know that they will profit from free trade more than anyone else. A free trade world is one in which Americans are going to be able to dominate. Interestingly, everyone but Japan signed on to the open door notes. And so the other countries in China were willing to work with the United States with the prospect of being able to open up the American market for their goods. So the rest of the world, except for Japan, is buying into this vision, but it's a vision ultimately that is going to serve. To what extent it serves other countries' interests, to what extent it serves the cause of world peace, it absolutely is going to solve America. It's going to serve American interests of expanding our economic power through a free trade policy, because we are, again, we stand best to be able to benefit from this. And so here we have the Philippines, here we have access theoretically to the China market. The question then becomes, is it possible to dominate the world economically and culturally, and not also have to dominate the world politically and militarily too? The way that Americans are thinking about their expansion, they're thinking that they're going to be able to engage in commercial expansion without forming entangling alliances. They're thinking that we're going to be able to enjoy commercial and cultural supremacy in the world without having to engage in the kind of imperialism that had characterized countries of the past. Well, what does history tell us about this? The great world empires, the Babylonian, the Assyrian Empire, the Roman Empire, the British Empire. These were all empires that were commercial, cultural, expansionary. Did they also become involved in formal political and military control and expansion as well? Yes. Fast forward to throughout the 20th century. Did the United States in the 20th century and into the 21st century, do we dominate the world economically and culturally? Absolutely we do. But did we also have to come to dominate the world politically and militarily as well too? We have the largest economy in the world. Does the United States have the largest military in the world? Yes, of course we do. The world spends about $1.5 trillion on military expenditures each year. Half of that is spent by the United States. So, the answer to this question, can you dominate the world culturally and economically and not also have to dominate the world politically and militarily as well too? The answer from history is no. Inevitably, economics and military and political power and cultural power, it's all going to become entangled. And we will tell that story as we continue through this class, but we have to recognize it starting here at this time because this is the first generation and the first time that Americans were thinking we can do this. We can dominate the world culturally and militarily and not also have to involve ourselves in entangling alliances with other countries. But of course, we can see from the very beginning that that's not happening, right? We engage in a military dominance of the Philippines. It's ultimately a military conquest. It's a formal empire that we establish in the Philippines for decades ahead. So, even from this period of time, the answer is no. We can't purely engage in soft power expansion. The soft power is going to have to be met by the hard political and military power as well, too. And Roosevelt understood this. That's why Roosevelt was such an advocate for developing a more martial culture within the United States, for developing military power. It's under him that we have a new Navy, the Great White Fleet, as it was called. So Roosevelt understood that economic power was going to have to be met by a military power. He understood his British history. British economic expansion had been accomplished by a brilliant navy like the British Navy. So he understood this. There's the Great White Fleet at sail on a world tour, showing off American military power, not just our economic power. But what about Woodrow Wilson in World War I? This is kind of the first great test of this question. Can the United States engage in military and can the Americans engage in continuing economic, commercial expansion and also avoid becoming involved in entangling alliances and including war? So Wilson becomes president in 1912, promising to move away from the more militaristic tendencies of a Teddy Roosevelt. He is immediately confronted with a world at war in 1914. Somebody sneezed, and World War I broke out. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that. It has everything to do with the tensions that had been growing between the European powers in Asia over this, all the different imperial projects going on, and finally things exploded in 1914. The United States immediately declares neutrality, but the question then becomes, what form does neutrality take? one American, William Jennings Bryan, Secretary of State under Wilson, believed that neutrality had needed to be an absolute neutrality. The United States, not only are we not going to aid either side in this combat, we're not going to sell to either side in this combat. Because Bryan understood if we're selling to one or the other side in this conflict, we're becoming invested in this war and a particular kind of victory in this war. The problem is, how does the United States cut itself off commercially from selling to the United States? Who were our chief trading partners in the world at this time? It was Europe. Most of our excess goods went to Europe. If we stop selling to Europe, you want to talk about an overproduction problem. You want to talk about a depression in the United States. So we simply can't do it. And so Bryan is very quickly overridden by Woodrow Wilson, who defines neutrality. And Bryan ultimately, he was such a pacifist. He understood where this was going to end up, and he actually leaves the government over this. Wilson defines neutrality this way. Americans are going to trade with both sides in this conflict. So we're going to trade with the Axis powers. We're going to trade with the Allied powers. The Axis were headed by Germany, the Allied by England and France. We're going to trade with both sides in this conflict, but technically we're neutral. So when our ships are selling, our ships are sailing military hardware or agricultural medical supplies to England, Germany, you should leave our ships alone. Conversely, when we're selling arms to Germany, England, France, you should leave us alone. And we said this is neutrality. But I got to ask you, is that neutrality? Were we really neutral in this? We're giving bank loans to Germany and England and France so they could buy American products. Some of it military hardware, gunpowder. I think 60% of all gunpowder used in World War I was produced by an American company, DuPont. It was crazy how much the United States is supplying the war effort in World War I, in this case, gunpowder. I think the DuPont company eventually in the 1930s were called the merchants of death, or the powder people, because they had really made World War I possible. But we're supposedly neutral in this conflict. Well, of course we're not neutral in this. And as the United States continues in this, now initially we had some significant conflicts with England. There was a chance that we were even going to go to war with England because they were stopping our ships, because they understood American neutrality was bunk. Like, what country in their right mind would allow ships carrying military hardware to go to their enemies that they know are then going to be used to turn around and kill their own citizens? They're not going to allow it. So the British were harassing our ships. But nevertheless, we tried to continue this policy, and Woodrow Wilson's head was just spinning as he's trying to work. 1 minute he's on the phone with the British and French, the next minute he's on the phone with the Germans. He's trying to get everybody to leave our ships alone while our ships continue to aid both sides in this conflict. This is what Thomas Jefferson during the Napoleonic Wars. We tried to do the same thing in the Napoleonic Wars. We tried to say we were neutral, but we tried to trade with both sides. Jefferson called this growing fat off of Europe's folly. The idea was, as Europe tears itself apart, we will supply both sides, and we will make a killing, literally and financially. We're going to make a lot of money off of this conflict while Europe tears itself apart. That didn't work in the Napoleonic Wars. It does work in World War I. Americans are making a killing, literally and financially, off of their trade in this conflict. We continue to give massive loans to England, France, and for a while Germany, which they then turn around to buy American goods. And American companies are just making ridiculous profits off of this. But what's happening? Our attempt to grow fat off of Europe's folly, to engage in the commercial supremacy, to profit off of war, is involving us not just in World War I, but in a particular kind of victory. as more of our loans and more of our products go to England and France, we are becoming involved in an English and French and Axis victory. And not surprisingly, Germany increasingly turns against the United States, trying to stop, harass, and even sink our ships. Hence the Lusitania situation. A lot of people think the Lusitania brought us into the war. No, that was 1915 when that happened. The sinking of the Lusitania, and we know now it was actually carrying military hardware intended for England and France. Germany sank that. Wilson actually got secured from Germany a pledge that they are going to stop harassing American ships, and so Wilson wins re-election in 1916. He kept us out of the war. But then, no sooner is he taking his his second inauguration in 1917 than Germany is saying, 1917 we're going to start sinking all American ships again. And then the Zimmerman note comes up that Germany had been secretly telling Mexico to invade the United States. And the United States finds itself involved now in World War I because of the way that we try to have our cake and eat it too. We try to profit off of war while staying out of this war. Wilson did not want us involved in this war. He had gone to Detroit in 1916 and to a group of businessmen in Detroit and had encouraged them to engage in what he called the peaceful conquest of the world. Wilson believed that American influence would be, he believed the world would be Americanized in the 20th century, but he believed it would be done peacefully. It could be done peacefully. But at the same time, his policies are inching us closer and closer to war until finally in 1917 we do go to war. But we go to war to what? Make the world safe for the open door, to protect American investment, to protect the American economy. All of those things were true, but that's not what Wilson said we were going to war, was it? Why were we going to war? To make the world safe for democracy. Again, remember the cultural argument in the 20th century always covers over the economic argument for expansion. We are making the world safe for democracy, when in reality we are trying to make the world safe for the open door. We conclude this part of the lecture, and I'm sorry, I know it's gone long, because there's so much foreign policy stuff to cover here. With the 14 points, you'll be reading this for your threaded discussion this week, and so I don't want to go too much into it, but I do want to highlight a few points. The idea of Wilson being committed to a principle of self-determination or anti-colonialism, I think that was the fifth point. So when you read through the 14 points, recognize the fifth point as this. He won't use the language there, self-determination. It's actually a word that the Russian, the communists, the Bolsheviks, Vladimir Lenin actually is the originator of the idea of self-determination. But Wilson kind of takes this idea over and makes it the fifth point of his 14-point speech. So you'll read that in there. Of course, Wilson's idea of the League of Nations and collective security is point 14 in there, where he talks about a general association of nations. This, collective security was the idea that if everybody in the league was committed to a defensive pact, say Brazil decides to attack Guam, and Guam is a part of the League of Nations, Brazil wouldn't be attacking Guam. Brazil would be attacking the United States, in England and France too, and of course then Brazil would never attack Guam, right? Because they wouldn't want to have to fight the entire world. This is the ideal of collective security. It's one the Americans ultimately, you probably know this, the Americans ultimately don't join the League of Nations, and it has everything to do with we don't want to be a part of this collective security pact. We don't want to, as the cartoon suggested there, we don't want to have our hands tied by other countries' affairs. The whole no entangling alliances ideal was one that was still pretty powerful, especially after World War I. And so you'll be reading about these things in the 14 points, and so it'll be interesting to see what thoughts you have there. And of course, we can discuss them too, and I can go into a little bit more detail about some of the things that results from World War I, like the mandate system, the League of Nations. But in many ways, I think the most important part of the speech isn't the actual points themselves. Understand, as you read through the 14 points too, 5 and 14 are interesting ones, but look especially at all the other ones, especially the opening 4. And you'll see, I think, there the open door. You'll see Wilson as an open door enthusiast. So, just be aware of that too. But in some ways, the most important part of this speech, I think, is the paragraph that precedes his list of the 14 points, where he talks about America not wanting anything specific out of this war, and America's, the world's peace, or America's peace platform is the world's peace platform, and the only peace platform there is the 14 points. This is an expression of what I call, in other historians have called universal nationalism. It's the idea that what's best for the world is best for America. What's best for America is best for the world. It's the idea that one country and one country's interests are somehow best for the entire world. This is one of the first times that a U.S. president, Roosevelt didn't do this. Wilson is in many ways the first president to suggest that American leadership of the world is in the best interest, not just of America, but in the best interest of the world too. And that America has gained so much power and so much responsibility from exercising that power that we have have the privilege of not just saying this is, these 14 points are what we want to see out of this war. Wilson's presuming to say, as he would say, this is what the world should be like. The world should be like the 14 points. This is not American interest. This is what everyone ultimately values. And so the United States, and in this case, Woodrow Wilson speaking on behalf of the United States, is presuming to say this is what the rest of the world should be like, should value. And what's confused in all of this is the difference between national interest and world interest. You can ask yourself, can any country in the world, even a superpower, ultimately speak for the best interests of the other peoples of the world? Is that possible? Wilson is saying it is possible. Wilson is saying Americans can do that, and ultimately, I think the real power of this speech, or the real significance of the speech, is not just the individual 14 points, many of them which were time-bound, especially the 7 through 13 that deal more with territorial issues. In some ways, the most significant part of the speech is where Wilson assumes this kind of universal nationalist idea that America somehow is uniquely situated to speak for, not just to, but speak for the interests of everyone on the planet. You might see that as hubris, or you might see as, what other country by 1920 was really situated to do that? And so, or you might look at the history of the 20th century and say, look, the kind of things that Americans have valued, the kind of things Americans have done in the world, really have been best for the world. It's been better for the world to have been Americanized in the 20th century. And so ultimately Woodrow Wilson has been proven right. You might come to that conclusion too. But these are the kind of conversations we need to have in discussion. All right, part 1 is done. I am sorry for the length of it.